So today's lecture is going to be dealing with the last of our series of lectures on the Ukrainian Ruthenian lands located in the Austrian, now Austro-Hungarian Empire. And this is then during the second half of our long 19th century, 1849 to 1914. Now, as we've seen during the revolutionary events of 1848, that period, 1848, the revolutionary year, spreading a little bit into 1849, to borrow the well-known phrase, had become a veritable spring of nations, as it was called. And this is throughout all of the European continent, not only among the Ruthenian Ukrainians, nor even among the various peoples of the Austrian Empire. All were affected by this so-called spring of nations, particularly the case in Galicia, which is our topic, where, as we saw in our lecture of 1848-49, the first Ruthenian political organization, so the first political organizations for Ukrainians anywhere, the first newspapers, cultural societies, military formations were even founded. And all of these developments came rather suddenly, but because the circumstances were supported largely by the Austrian imperial government in Vienna. On the other hand, the mass of the Ruthenian Ukrainian population was really not ready to enter the modern political realm. Much work still had to be done in terms of education, economic development, political experience. And this is precisely what took place in a relatively large scale during the second half of our long 19th century, between 1849 and 1914. In fact, it is during this period that the Ruthenian national movement, and most especially in Galicia, of course, we remember, perhaps it doesn't hurt to recall that we're talking about three areas in the Austrian Empire where Ruthenians, Ukrainians lived: Galicia and Bukovina in the Austrian half, and Transcarpathia in the Hungarian, quote-unquote, half of the Habsburg Empire. But we'll focus primarily here on Galicia, where the Ruthenian Ukrainian national movement went through both the second organizational stage and the third political stage of what we know as intelligentsia-inspired national movements. But before the movement could have success or move forward through these stages, it was necessary first to have, or to try to have, ideological unity. That is, to have a clear idea of just who this East Slavic population living in Eastern Galicia, Northern Bukovina, and Hungarian Transcarpathia actually was. And it was this struggle among the intelligentsia to try to find some kind of consensus on nationality, which actually marked much of the experience of the national movement among the Ruthenians, Ukrainians in the Austrian Empire during the second half of our long 19th century. As long as the movement, if you will, remained small, the issue of national identity was confined to a, on the one hand, very limited number of intellectuals who, as we saw before 1848, really limited themselves to arguing about language. What was, quote unquote, our national language? What should it be? But after 1848, after that revolutionary era, when Ruthenian Ukrainians entered the political, educational, and organizational sphere of Austro-Hungarian life, the stakes now were higher, and the need for a clearer understanding of national identity was more pressing than ever before. This search for clarification was carried out by the Ruthenian intelligentsia, but it was not straightforward. Now, it is true that some of these leaders, the elite of Galician Ruthenian society, were quite satisfied with associating, even assimilating, if possible, with the dominant nationality in the region where they lived. That would be Polish nationality in the case of Galicia, the Austro-German in the case of Bukovina, or the Hungarian in the case of Transcarpathia. So yes, there were those who leaned in those directions of accommodation and even assimilation. But for those among the intelligentsia, and they were the majority, who remained wedded to their East Slavic ethno-linguistic and religious identity, they became divided into three factions. And it's those three factions which are listed on the chart which I handed out. Three factions, or what we might call three national orientations. And as you see listed here, the old Ruthenians, the populist Ukrainophiles, and the Russophiles. Let's keep one thing in mind here. These are not three different peoples living in different parts of Galicia, or these are the same people. Just ideologically, they have different ideas as to who they are. Well, how did these three orientations differ from each other? And also, in what ways, if any, were they similar? Basically, their differences stemmed from differing and even conflicting interpretations regarding the historical past and the national language. The language question never goes away and will never go away even after this long 19th century. All three orientations, all three used the same term to describe themselves and or the people who they ostensibly represented and the culture that they ostensibly represented. Namely, they were the people of Rus, who called themselves in their language Rusini. So the people of Rus and Rusini, which in English comes out to be often Ruthenian, and for that matter in German as well, Ruthenian. And that they spoke a language, as you can see on our chart, their adjectival form, which they called Ruski, from Rus. Let's start with those of these three orientations which clearly differed from each other. The Ukrainophiles. They argued that this ethnonym Rusin and its adjective Ruski were older historic forms of the more modern and therefore preferable terms Ukrainci, Ukrainians, and Ukrainsky, the adjective Ukrainian. That being the case, that the language spoken by the group and its name should be called Ukrainian. The Russophiles, they argued that these terms, these very same terms, Ruthenian as the ethnonym, Ruski as the adjective, were simply local variants of the ethnonym Russkoe, as you can see on your chart. Which in English would be Russian and Russians. Therefore, the people in question, these Ruthenians, and their language that they spoke, were really Russian. Or more precisely, Little Russian, or the Little Russian dialect of the Russian language. Now, the oldest of these three orientations, literally called Old Ruthenians, continued to use the original terms Ruseni and Ruski in the sense that the concept of Ruthenianism was limited to the East Slavs within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, while Galicia's Old Ruthenians never quite argued that they formed a separate nationality, in practice, their perceptual horizons were limited to the realm of the Habsburgs. So these Ruthenians, these old Ruthenians, only live in the Habsburg Empire. Now, behind what may seem a semantic sleight of hand, or simple play with words, there were profound perceptual differences between these three orientations, but especially between the Ukrainophiles and the Russophiles, both of whom, as I've just said, evolved from these old Ruthenians, as you can see on the chart, though they eventually eclipsed the old Ruthenians on Galicia's cultural front by the end of our long 19th century. Now, like the old Ruthenians, who felt a vague sense of unity with the entire East Slavic world, like them, the Russophiles considered the three branches of the East Slavs, which they called Great Russians, modern-day Russians, Byelorussians, modern-day Belarusians, and Little Russians, modern-day Ukrainians, all three of them to comprise one Russian, or, as they said, common Russian nationality and language, общерусский, as you can see on your chart. Now, the old Ruthenians and the Russophile proponents did admit that there were differences, in fact, recognizable cultural and linguistic differences between these, what they call three components of this common Russian people. But the Russophiles went a step further, argued that members of all three of these East Slavic components should identify themselves as Russian and use the literary Russian language for intellectual discourse. This argument has not gone away. It's an argument that is used at the very present, certainly since the beginning of the 21st century, as if a return to history by that leader of the Russian Federation. This is literally his theory, because it's not a new theory. And in this sense, the Russophiles in the Austrian Empire were similar to those Ukrainians or Little Russians in the Russian Empire, we're talking now about the 19th century, who believed in that hierarchy of multiple loyalties. That is, they considered themselves Russians from Little Russia, in this case, Russians from Galicia. Now, the Ukrainophiles here in the Austrian Empire believe that the idea of this alleged one common Russian nationality was simply an ideological fantasy. Instead, they felt that they belonged to a distinct Ukrainian nationality that lived on compact ethnographic territory that stretched from the Carpathian Mountains, this shaded area on this map, not only all of Galicia, not all of the southern part of the Russian Empire, but also which stretched down to the Caucasus Mountains. That is more or less Ukraine today, plus more lands to the east that at the time and still today are inhabited by ethnic Ukrainians, even though they're located within the Russian Federation. By the way, this kind of geographic turn of phrase or formulation, that is from the Carpathians to the Caucasus, was intended to counteract the Russophile slogan in which the Russophiles spoke of one Russian people, also beginning at the Carpathians, but in their case, ending in Kamchatka on the Pacific Ocean. In short, the national movement in Eastern Galicia during the second half of our long historic 19th century can be considered or viewed as one in which Ukrainophiles and Russophiles emerged from the old Ruthenians, and how by the end of our period, the outbreak of World War I, the old Ruthenians more or less disappeared, while the Ukrainophiles had for the most part been victorious over the Russophiles in becoming the main representatives of the national movement. So much for the conceptual aspect of the national movement, if you will. Now, how did this actually play itself out concretely? Well, the scenario that I've just described, we can graphically see in the evolution of what? The language question. The language question. First of all, each of these orientations had publications, newspapers, books, journals, grammars, teaching tools. In each of these three quote-unquote languages, that is, the old Ruthenians were using basically Old Slavonic, the Ukrainians, the populist Ruthenians were using a vernacular-based language that is reflecting of how people spoke actually in Galicia, and the Russophiles were using Russian. But this language question, these differences, it came to a head in 1892 when the Austrian government stepped in, as we're going to see, and decided in favor of the populist Ukrainian orientation. Also, each of these orientations publishing works of literature, and works of literature are always very important. We saw this in the Russian Empire among Ukrainians. Having a great writer in and of itself raises the prestige of the language. Well, of all the three orientations, it was only the Ukrainian orientation who had what one could be called an exceptional writer. Almost the equivalent of Shevchenko in the Russian Empire was a man named Ivan Franko in the Austrian Galicia. Wide range of literary works, clearly making it evident that Ukrainian can be used and as a prestigious language in the realm of literature. Now, with regard to organizational life, because we're in this organizational stage, the national movement in Galicia experienced a vibrant development during this period. The oldest organizations, something called the Staropegil Institute, which went way back to the early 18th century already. But then the new National Home and the Galician Rus Matica, created, reconfigured in 1848 and 1849, they continue to remain in the hands of the old Ruthenians. Each of these organizations had libraries, museums, archives, print shops as part of their operations, almost all based in the administrative center of Galicia, Lviv. And they were responsible for publishing many newspapers, journals, scholarly works, school texts. But by and large, these organizations had little direct contact with the rural peasant masses living in the Galician countryside. A group of younger old Ruthenians who quickly became concerned, or were concerned with the population as a whole, that's why they're called populists. They hoped to correct the situation of, if not alienation, separation from the countryside as a whole. They tried to enter, they could enter, but couldn't take over the old Ruthenian organizations. And so they created their own. And in terms of impact on the masses, eventually the most influential organization was something called the Prosvita Society. Prosvita means enlightenment. Also based in Lviv, virtually all the organizations are based in the administrative center. 1868. Its main goal was to promote culture and education, both at the popular level and initially literature as well, belles lettres. But by the 1870s, they were concentrating primarily on popular work, popular publications, and bringing them to the people directly. And how did they do that? Well, they established what were known as reading rooms, chitalny, through as many villages throughout the province as possible. They also organized stores, community warehouses, savings and loan banks, agricultural and commercial cooperatives. Prosvita's efforts in this important field of economic activity were not in isolation. I mentioned cooperatives. Prosvita had some cooperatives, but there was a much larger cooperative movement that became particularly widespread during the 1890s. And by the end of our period, 1914, there were more than 500 Ruthenian cooperatives and mutual credit associations of various kinds, insurance companies, trade associations, farmer associations. All were operated by what came to be known as these populist Ukrainophiles, and all of them helped the peasant and tradespeople in obtaining credit, as well as the means to produce and sell their products. And so this organic socioeconomic growth in the crucial economic sphere that was combined with and carried out now in a Ukrainian national spirit. I might add that as you all were in a city called Toronto, where there are many Ukrainians, in particular, who came from this old Austrian province of Galicia, although much later, but some of you may interact with one of the products of this organization, or these cooperatives. If you like kefir, or if you like cream, some of the best of it comes from something called Mick Dairy. Very kind of MC Dairy is what it's called. Actually, it's not Mick Dairy, it's Maslosoiuz, which is the Ukrainian words MS for butter union. It was the largest and most powerful of these cooperatives, founded already at the very dawn of the chronological 20th century in Austrian Galicia, continued in the interwar years, and then when all private businesses were abolished and banned under direct Soviet rule, they moved to Canada. And so we still have Maslosoiuz, but it's Mick Dairy, as if it sounds much more Scottish or Irish. Now, in 1873, these populist Ukrainophiles founded a new organization to promote very specifically literature and literary scholarship, and it was known as the Shevchenko Society. Notice named after the great national bard, but from Russian-ruled Ukraine. This Shevchenko Society, again, based in Lviv, was actually created on the initiative and with financial support from many wealthy Ukrainians living in the Russian Empire. In 1892, the organization changed its profile, was renamed the Shevchenko Scientific Society. 5 years later, received a new president, the dynamic historian, also from the Russian Empire, man named Mikhailo Hrushevsky. We've met that name several times and will continue to do so. He now becomes the president of the Shevchenko Scientific Society. He was already head of the Department of, effectively, Ukrainian history at the University of Lviv. Under his leadership, which lasted until 1913, the Shevchenko Scientific Society became, for all intents and purposes, an unofficial Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, permanent and corresponding members from all Ukrainian lands, regardless of what empire they were located in. Published a very important scholarly journal, a whole host of other scholarly publications. The point here is that those other two groups, the old Ruthenians and the Russophiles, could just not keep up with the organizational talent of the populist Ukrainophiles. Now, it is true that the old Ruthenians did follow the lead of the Prosvita Society. They established in 1874 something called the Kachkovskyi Society, also with reading rooms and publications, with some influence throughout the Galician provinces, as many as they had as many as 9,000 members. But in fact, the old Ruthenians and later Russophiles had nothing else to compare with the populist Ukrainophiles, who also had a theater. And with that orientation's widespread network of cooperative societies and credit associations, by the end of our period, it was the populist Ukrainophiles who had the lead in spreading their version of national understanding amongst the largest portion of population in Austrian Galicia. Education, always very important. The populist Ukrainophiles, or we can say the Ruthenians in general in Galicia, relative to their actual numbers, were unequal to the Poles in the province. But in absolutist terms, and considering the total lack of any Ukrainian language school system in the Russian Empire, the Ruthenians in Galicia made remarkable progress during the second half of our long 19th century. On the eve of World War I, there were approximately 3,500 elementary schools in eastern Galicia, 71% of them, 2,500, in which Ruthenian, Ukrainian, or some form of it was the language of instruction. That's the elementary level. If we look at the secondary level, the Ukrainians had 6 gymnasia, senior high schools, 15 private gymnasia. 6 were state-owned, then they had private gymnasia. Also 10 teachers' colleges, each of which, in the case of teachers' colleges, were bilingual, Polish and Ukrainian. And again, to repeat, most important from the standpoint of the debate over the proper national orientation was the fact that in 1893, the Austrian government accepted the vernacular spoken Ruthenian, that is Ukrainian language, as the standard for instructional purposes. What did that mean? For all intents and purposes, the old Ruthenian and the Russophile orientations were officially eliminated from the all-important state educational system. Now, whereas Ukrainians did not have their own university, they did have several departments at the University of Lviv, which actually gave Ukrainian language, was taught in Ukrainian language, both in Ukrainian-related subjects and in some non-Ukrainian subjects, such as law and theology. Of these departments, or professorial chairs as they are known, the original one was 1848 during the Revolution, the chair of Ruthenian language and literature. Then we had the one in history in the early 1890s, where this Hrushevsky held. And then there were 8 more, totaling 10 of these departments at the University of Lviv by 1914. Now, another factor, we've been mentioning the language question and cultural organizations, but there's religion, always important in traditional societies, such as Galician Ruthenian society was. And as for religion, the Greek Catholic Church was the dominant, virtually at this time, at the beginning of our period, virtually all of Galician Ruthenians were Greek Catholics. And we know what that is because we've looked at that more than once. Well, that church initially adopted a rather standoffish attitude toward the national movement. One might ask why. Well, after all, nationalism, like religion, is an ideology. And as such, it was becoming more attractive to an increasingly greater number of people who otherwise might have directed their ideological and spiritual, perhaps financial as well, psychic energies exclusively to the church. So in that sense, began to be a rival of religion. But all that changed when in 1900, the Vatican appointed a man named Andrei Shevchenko Shevchenko. He was appointed literally in the year 1900 as Metropolitan Archbishop of Galicia's Greek Catholics. That is the highest administrative office. This Shevchenko was tolerant, but he firmly objected or rejected the old Ruthenian and the Russophile positions regarding national identity. And because of that position, the Ukrainophiles now had a leader who was able to restore the historic relationship, symbiotic relationship between religion and one's national identity. In effect, under Shevchenko's leadership, the Greek Catholic Church in Galicia became a stronghold of Ukrainianism. Third stage of intelligentsia-inspired national movements, political. Now, with regard to politics, the national movement during our period was influenced by developments at three levels, and that's why we spoke about, or spent some time speaking about the structure of the Austrian Empire. Why? Because there was the provincial Galician level, where there was a diet, an elected diet. There was the imperial level, an imperial parliament in Vienna. And so politics played itself out in the province, in the imperial capital. And then there was the international level, if you will. And I'll explain that in a moment. As for Galicia itself, Ruthenian political life was marked primarily by a struggle to achieve four goals. So what did the Ruthenians want? One, the division of Galicia into two parts, each of which would have its own diet, its own administration, and its own board of education. And those two parts would be a Ukrainian part in the east and a Polish part in the west. The second desire or demand was equality for the Ruthenian Ukrainian language in schools and public life. The third was to establish a Ukrainian university. And the fourth, the implementation of universal suffrage. So these are the demands that they continued to put forth, both in the Galician Diet as well as in the imperial parliament in Vienna. Now, with the exception of universal suffrage, the Ukrainians failed to achieve fully any of these basic political goals. But they did make some gains. Now, at first, Ukrainian political desires were expressed through umbrella-like organizations, but more influential were political parties, which first came into being in the 1890s. And here there was a whole slew, a whole range of political parties, all legal, all participating fully in the political process at the provincial level and at the imperial level. And these parties came into being not only representing Ukrainophiles, but some of them also Russophiles. The Russophiles also had their own political parties. Now, most of these political parties supported the idea of living within Austria, Austria-Hungary, even cooperation at times with the Poles in Galicia. And they pushed for these modest political and cultural demands. Those were most of the political parties. But there were others that called for radical social economic transformation. And then still others called for unification either with Ukrainians or with Russians in the Russian Empire. And so these political parties and their demands played out in both the Galician Diet and the Austrian Imperial Parliament. Now, the national movement among the East Slavs, in these northeastern lands of the Habsburg Empire, Galicia, Bukovina, Hungarian Transcarpathia, this national movement among them also had serious international implications. And those came to light during the last decades of this long 19th century ending in 1914. Not surprisingly, Austria-Hungary's large neighbor to the east, and it's right there, the Russian Empire, was the most important of these international factors. But another less evident player in these affairs was the United States. Now, this sounds a bit weird. Why is that? Well, first, the Russian Empire. The Tsarist Russian government, for decades, if not for centuries, accepted the Russophile view that Galicia, for that matter also Bukovina and Hungarian Transcarpathia, from their perspective had been part of the medieval entity called Kievan Rus, and consequently one day should be united, as they said, once again with Mother Russia. The imperial capital and administration, the Tsarist administration, St. Petersburg, was therefore willing to give support to any elements in Galicia that were in agreement with those ideological goals. And what kind of support? Well, they gave money to old Ruthenian and then Russophile newspapers. They sent money and contact through the Russian imperial embassy in Vienna, met with various Galician Russophile activists and also old Ruthenian activists in the beginning. And then when Austria lost that war against Sardinia in France in 1859 and Prussia in 1866, all of these factors suggested to several old Ruthenian leaders that Austria was on the decline and that the day seemed imminent when Russia would take over Galicia. Now, you can imagine this bothered the Austrian imperial government, and so alarmed was it that it arranged a treason trial in Lviv in 1882, at which several old Ruthenian leaders from Galicia and also Russophile leaders from Hungarian Transcarpathia were accused of promoting orthodoxy and seeking to detach Ruthenian inhabited lands from Austria-Hungary. Now, in the end, all of them were acquitted of those charges of high treason, which carried a death penalty, by the way. But even though acquitted, the old Ruthenian orientation now became tainted in the eyes of certainly official Austrian society, as well as large numbers of Galician Ruthenians as well. So the old Ruthenians start to lose their influence, whatever influence they had. But the authorities in St. Petersburg, the Tsarist authorities in St. Petersburg, found new supporters in Galicia, this time among the Galician Russophiles, many of whom openly declared their hope in becoming part of Russia, others more silently, looking forward to that same eventuality. Now, as part of its stepped-up campaign against the Habsburg Austrian government, the Tsar's government also gave large sums of money to spread the idea of orthodoxy among Greek Catholics in Galicia and Transcarpathia, the idea that these Greek Catholics, which were once Orthodox, should return to Orthodoxy. And so they gave support to the Orthodox movement, and in particular, among immigrants from those areas. Remember, there was a large immigration from Galicia and Transcarpathia in the United States. In fact, the rapid growth of Russian Orthodoxy in the United States was encouraged by Tsarist policy during these 2 decades before the outbreak of World War I. So Greek Catholics, these immigrants come to North America as Greek Catholic. They return to the faith of their fathers, the Orthodox Church, in the United States. And then those immigrants helped to spread that faith in their native villages, either when they returned home or by sending money to support Orthodoxy. The Carpathian region, which many immigrants had come from, was particularly susceptible. Bukovina, on the other hand, was always Orthodox in any case. But now the mountainous areas of southwestern Galicia and Hungarian Transcarpathia began to be Orthodox strongholds as well. Well, okay, so what's the problem? It's just a religion. They're returning to the faith of their forefathers. Well, Orthodoxy became equated not only with faith in God, but with faith in the Tsar, and identification with the Russian nationality. And to encourage further those developments, a Galician Russian Benevolent Society was established in the Tsar's capital, St. Petersburg, in 1908. A Carpatho-Russian Liberation Committee in Kiev in 1913. And so Russophilism, in the form of Orthodoxy, was given a new lease on life in the Austrian Empire on the eve of World War I. Now, it is also true that the populist Ukrainophiles were also influenced by developments beyond the boundaries of Galicia. Primarily, this took the form of interaction between Dnieper Ukrainian activists or national leaders and their brethren farther west. Very important figure named Mikhail Drahomanov travels from Russian-ruled Ukraine, gives great support to those populist Ukrainophiles, in particular this Ievhen Franko. But the person of most importance who left an indelible imprint on the Galician life, and for that matter, all Ukrainian cultural activity, was this Mikhailo Hrushevsky. There were efforts among other populist Ukrainophiles to cooperate with the local Poles in Galicia, but Hrushevsky totally opposed to this. He felt that in the relatively more liberal environment of Austria, Galician Ukrainians should build a solid national and cultural social fabric, which could then serve as a kind of Piedmont, a basis for a future independent Ukrainian state, also which would include lands in the Russian Empire. In such a situation, Galicia seemed to be the only place where Ukrainian national life could function. And let me end here with a comment by a Ukrainian political activist, actually from the Russian Empire. And he said, Galicia was for us a model in the struggle for our nation's rebirth. It strengthened our faith and hope for a better future. Galicia was a true Piedmont of Ukraine because prior to 1906, a Ukrainian press, scholarship, and national life could develop only there. And Galician Ukrainian populist activists themselves said, and I'll conclude here, in December 1912, quote, with a view to the welfare and future of the Ukrainian nation on both sides of the border, in case of war between Austria and Russia, the entire Ukrainian people will unanimously and resolutely stand on the side of Austria against the Russian Empire as the greatest enemy of Ukraine. You see, there is talk of war already. And it is to that dastardly situation that we will return on Thursday. Thank you.